Welcome back to MFO, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to another episode. You know, this was probably 50 years ago or so, but that's when I started bass fishing, and the place I started bass fishing is right here, right off the bank. And so today we're going to talk about bank fishing. And I know that we do 95% of our fishing out of boats and things like that, but the reality is that my guess is that we all started fishing from the bank. And there are some baits that are 100% more beneficial to use when you're fishing from the bank than when you're fishing from the boat. Then there's some tactics or strategies to use when you're fishing from the bank that it's important to keep in mind. So today we're going to talk a little bit about baits and strategies for when you are bank fishing for bass. And let's see if we can't catch one or two while we're doing it, okay? Stick around, guys. Welcome back to Mark Fisher Outdoors, everybody. I'm Mark Fisher. So we're on the bank, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the baits that I use and the strategies that I use when I am on the bank and when I'm fishing. And we've done a few bank pond fishing episodes before in the past, but I don't know that I've specifically talked about the baits or strategies to use if you're, and I don't even want to say stuck on the bank. Quite honestly, this doesn't feel like being stuck. This feels like, hey, I'm returning back to the days when, that's the kind of fishing that I did. Would be grab a couple of rods, just a box or a bag of different baits, not a whole, boat full of baits, just, a few of them, and, go out and do the best you can. Well, that's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about what baits do you use. When you're bank fishing, the reality is that you're probably not going to be fishing a lot of crankbait kind of baits, treble hook kind of baits, because you don't know, what kind of cover you're going to have, and you're not going to be able, if you get snagged, you're not going to be able to go and retrieve that lure, which kind of leads right off the bat. The first types of baits that I like to throw when I'm fishing off the bank are topwaters. A frog, a hollow-bellied frog, or maybe a Xerospook or a popper, depending on the situation. So I'm going to go out on this pier that's right here, right off the bank, and I've got some lily pads over there. We'll see if we can't get something to happen with a topwater. Then we'll come back and talk about some other baits as well. So I haven't had a lot of success with that frog. I haven't thrown it too much, but I'm not feeling it over there. But I do want to, this is kind of a situation where I want to, if I'm working down this bank and I'm kind of walking down the bank, when I get to, let me move the camera over. You see this area over here. I think that's a good looking area, but I don't want to walk up to it. I have not walked over there yet or anything like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fish that area before I get right up on it, because I don't want to go up on it and then, maybe there's a fish hanging out by that seawall or something like that. So I'm going to make a few casts far away and see what happens with that. Oh, there it is right there. All right. Little bass. Right off that rock there. I didn't hook up with that fish, but The reality is I probably wouldn't even gotten the blow up had I gone over there and been right on top of it. So top waters are going to be my first go-to because, first of all, we're talking about exciting. That's the thing that got me hooked is when I was a teenager is throwing a frog and seeing that big 4-pound bass explode on my topwater, frog. So frogs, topwaters, those are going to be the first baits that I try when I'm fishing from the bank. Now the next thing that I'm going to go to is more of a swimming style bait, but again, not a crankbait with a lot of trebles. So I'm going to throw maybe a spinner bait and or a swim jig. So again, just to kind of go over the rundown of baits, start with topwaters like a frog, popper, buzz bait. Again, the reason with a frog, you can deal with all sorts of different cover with a frog. You can fish it over slop, you can fish it in the lily pads, you can fish it near rocks. You saw me casting into the rocks or past the rocks, but then once it got to the rocks, I could just kind of pop it out. It gives you a lot of versatility. Plus, you're not going to get snagged. You're not going to lose a lure. So there's a place to start, and it can catch some really big bass. Top waters, now move to your swimming style baits, whether it be a chatterbait, a spinner bait, a swim jig, and try those. I had several fish who hit that swim jig right over there. There's got to be I know there's a little rock over there, and they kind of hang out near there. I didn't get any hookups. I'm gonna go try that spinner bait over there and see if that works. And then obviously my next course of action is going to be a bottom bait, but I'm gonna use bottom baits that are more like a wacky rig Cinco that I can kind of keep off the top a little bit. Maybe a Texas rig worm. I can throw a jig, but those are baits that when you get a little heavier and you get a little more into the bottom bouncing and you're coming up the bank rather than working down it, you're more likely to get snagged in those kinds of things. So those, I'm not gonna not have them, I'm not gonna not throw them, but they're gonna be third on my list in terms of where I'm starting from. Real quick, just in terms of strategies that I use on the bank. I already told you one, which is before you get to it, throw to it prior to standing over it. If you're standing right over those fish, they're not likely gonna bite at that point. So if you see something that looks good, throw to it before you get to it. Irregular contours in your bank is what you're looking for. I'm gonna move that over. When I look at that riprap, I've got riprap, I've got a seawall, and then I've got the waterfall behind it. That's, flowing water. There has got to be a fish that's on that seawall over there. It may not be big, but there's got to be. And my guess is that if I'm going to catch it, I'm going to do it with a wacky rig. But we're going to try the moving baits first and do what happens. So irregular contours is one thing. The next thing is, quite honestly, it's non-existent here, but let me turn you around this way. If I was walking down this bank and all of a sudden halfway through there was a big clump of trees and the bank was just no one really could get in because this walkway went around and away from the bank and no one really would go in there, that would be the place that I would find a way to sneak in there and fish, or at least fish it from out here towards it, because The places where bank anglers can't get to are the places where the bass are, because they're not gonna get any kind of pressure at all. So irregular bank contours, and then places where most guys aren't willing to get into and fish from. Those would be two things that I would pay attention to. I'd also, quite honestly, one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to walk around. You see all these pontoon boats here. I'm going to walk around and just skip my frog underneath these pontoon boats. It's not a great day for it, but if it was sunny, those pontoon boats provide a lot of shade, and quite honestly, skipping from the front of a pontoon boat is a lot easier than skipping through the back where the motor is. And you can skip that frog underneath that front of that pontoon boat, and a lot of times you'll just hear that splash from underneath echo as they crash on your frog. So we're gonna get out here. We're gonna try and catch one of these, and we'll keep at it. There's one. Got one on the frog. That's a Berkeley Swamp Lord. Let me get that out of there for you. Just a little bass, but we're fishing around these bluegill beds using a frog and got one. All right, guys, so this video has been kind of all over the place. I've been walking up and down the bank, and so let me just kind of recap for you. Bank fishing, love it from a standpoint of what a nostalgic feeling. Brings me back to my teenage days of going out and fishing, and just because I love fishing. Top water baits is where I start. And again, part of that is because you're not going to get snagged, and a lot of times when you're fishing on the bank, you've got that scum and weed growth and things like that, and so those are the baits that you can catch fish on without risking losing your baits, whether it be a topwater frog or a popper, a buzz bait, something along those lines. Then you start getting into your moving baits, but again, moving baits without trebles. So you're talking about a swim jig, a chatterbait, spinner bait. And then obviously get to your bottom baits like a Cinco or a Texas rigged worm, maybe a light jig or something like that. If you do those kinds of things, you're not going to lose a lot of baits. They're very effective baits. And then pay attention when you're bank fishing that you look for irregularities in the cover, bends, points, coves, that kind of stuff, rocks. Lay downs, things like that. Look for those irregularities, and look for those places where you can fish where other guys can't get to it, or they're not willing to get to it. A place where the path is going along, and then all of a sudden there's a clump of trees or things like that. Those are the places that, those fish are going to hide there, because first of all, usually that obstacle, like a clump of trees, is going to provide shade and things like that. But there aren't any other bank anglers that are willing to kind of get through that stuff and catch those fish. So those are the places to look for when you're bank fishing. Those are the things to focus on. Go have some fun on the bank. Like I said, it brings back a lot of good memories. Guys, appreciate you tuning in, and we will see you tomorrow for another episode of Mark Fisher Outdoors. Take care, everybody.